I'm recording.
Can you hear me
Right.
now?
Oh,
Great.
forget that. Just
Yes, it does.
good egg general manager.
I was his boss.
Dan de Rijn.
Some interest in learning a bit more about
De Rijn.
technology, philosophy, and I like to.
Absolutely. We're going to stay anonymous.
Yeah, no worries.
The binary's gone. I thought jingle was like Dutch for cheers.
Hello, lovely people. Welcome to Beyond Binary Thinking, where we try and explore controversial and interesting topics and go beyond the tribal narratives of the left-right false dichotomies that divide and separate us. I am blessed once more by the gods of Reddit. Jay and Lindy Nelson have fallen in my lap here. We were discussing all sorts of strange tangents that we could discuss, but I think we settled ultimately on human consciousness, expanding that, and various ideas for how people can rethink psychology and reassess how we think mental health. So you guys have interesting backgrounds, interesting careers, from stand-up comedy, researching, writing books. It's probably best you introduce yourself better than I could, but thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you. So yeah, I'm a writer, researcher, and award-winning screenwriter. I'm obsessed with the study of consciousness. I used to be into acting and stand-up, and then I had a near-death experience that kind of realigned all my perceptions and showed me a different path, and I've been trying to live on that path for the last 7 years or so.
And hi, I'm Lindy. Right now, I am an executive assistant in the corporate world, handling very, very busy people in their very, very busy organizations. But I have a history in just keeping things moving. I produced movies. I've been a manager in escape rooms and doggy daycares and bakeries. A little bit of everything. I am a student of what makes a human, and I think that aligns well with my random professional career of just seeing all the little parts that make up a whole, and then therefore being able to better manage those parts. And so right now our focus is on what are the little parts that make up a human and what makes a human run.
I don't have as interesting an origin story, but I do have a master's in group processes and intergroup relations, specializing in evolutionary psychology. And so that's immediately where Jay and I were hitting off, bouncing ideas off each other, going from, what's interesting and good about psychology and kind of what's broken. And we rarely talk explicitly on psychology, but it's the undercurrent that underpins a lot of conversations we have about pop culture and what's wrong with the world and people. So it'd be good to kind of deep dive. Where do we start? There's so much to unpick.
I know, there is. I didn't know you were into evolutionary psychology, so that's amazing.
Well, it gets a bad rap because often, the likes of Jordan B. Peterson, who I have mixed feelings about, it's a complicated man, tries to derive an ought from an is, right? So says, this is how we existed in caveman times, therefore women shouldn't wear makeup in the office. And you're like, that's a leap, bro. That's a leap, and that's an Evel Knievel leap. So it gets a bad rap, but I do think, we will always be swimming against the current if we don't understand who we are and why we are, right? The greatest.
So, Chris, what are the tenets of evolutionary psychology?
The big useful ones, I suppose, are things like Dunbar's number. So the idea that whatever group you try and form, you're going to struggle to remember more than 150 people. And that sort of shows, right? Now I've got 2,000 friends on Facebook. Half of them pop up in my feed. I have no idea who they are. Like, for some reason, our brain's limit is determined by how we spent tens of thousands of years living. You understand things like in-group and out-group, tribalism, right? The need we have to feel like we are correct and smarter than the average person, and you see how tribal politics becomes and how much it resembles sports team fandom, and I think evolutionary psychology does very well. I think where it's obvious as well is explaining things like sexual attraction, sexual selection. Those are the things that are obviously most aligned with our evolutionary tendencies, right? I think the obvious thing is that humans are so adaptable. There's so many exceptions. This is why I love talking to Marang about anthropology and studying history and the exceptions that prove the rule, but also just, Polynesian culture where cooking is far too important a job to let women do, and men must do it proudly, right? These are important things to study, so you don't decide that just because cavemen did it, we must do it, right? But ultimately, I think evolutionary psychology just sort of helps us understand some of our worst instincts, right? Like what we can tend towards if we're not careful. I think I can explain a person through evolutionary psychology best when they're tired and hungry, right? When they're not activating the higher functions of the limbic system, when their lizard brain is raging. Like road rage is easily explained by your desire to ram your car into someone else's car, and there are a lot of videos of this. Is entirely stupid, but when you understand tired caveman brain is going to work and adrenaline fires.
Is one of the tenets of evolutionary psychology then that we haven't really evolved beyond the tribal organizations of society, that our modern way of living is really sort of behind still on
bad evolutionary psychology? Yes, at its best, like the strongest thing humans do is create culture, and that diverges and responds to different situational stimuli, right? And so at its best, it takes it into account, and it doesn't try and be the silver bullet panacea answer to every problem, right? Because culture obviously has overtaken, accelerated our ability. Like Richard Dawkins talks about this, how the meme is faster than the gene, right? Like an idea can be transmitted quicker than so we are not limited by our biology, but it would be foolish not to try and understand it and take it.
We have an interesting vantage point on the biology of it right now, because especially when you describe the hungry, sleepy brain. We just had a baby. He's 8 weeks old. He's hungry and sleepy. Thank you.
Congratulations.
But hungry and sleepy is how he communicates.
As are you, probably.
We're all hungry. We're all sleepy. And but
Yeah.
it's seeing and so watching his consciousness and his awareness come online in addition to just those basic drives of I'm hungry, I'm sleepy, I'm dirty. Pay attention to me. I want to be picked up. Physical touch. I want to be swaddled. It's watching all that come online, but it's also we've been learning more about babies in general lately, because that's what you do when you're new parents. And we actually just watched something the other day that was about how babies pay more attention to faces that are similar to the ones that are in their home. So it's like the science is showing not that babies are racist or anything, but just that they are
controversial opinion off the bat.
Yes,
everyone, your babies are racist.
No, but just they're drawn to what's familiar. Like biologically, where they see certain demographics from day to day. Usually, their parents or their caretakers, whoever they're around from day to day, and even from birth, we're drawn towards faces that are familiar. So it's it kind of shows a little bit in groups and out groups, but. Yeah, there is some biology to it. So
yeah, it's interesting to see where our culture then comes in, and he is very much raw instinct at this moment in time, but we will teach him things, eventually. But we are now, but yeah.
The race sensitivity classes can come later. Don't worry about that just yet.
Yeah. That's right.
So I think what we really started talking about that was interesting is a theory of depression, a theory of anxiety. So studying, psychology as I did, two things became apparent to me. One is called, it's from Alice in Wonderland. It's the dodo effect. The simplest way of describing it is, though, that modern therapies have really struggled to prove statistically that they are better than alternatives, right? There's no winner. Right. And if I was being generous, I would say that's because different treatments work for different people. But if I was to be cynical, I would say that this is part of the whole replication crisis with psychology as a soft, weak science, and so many of its principles are sort of unfounded. And this goes back to Freud as a crazy, coke-addled weirdo that was sleeping with most of his patients. The truth lies somewhere in between the two. How's that for an opening?
Always
Yeah.
does.
Well, I mean, just to pick up something on Freud, like people do give him a lot of shit. He discovered the idea of the unconscious, which is powerful. But the problem with Freud is that he, kind of categorized the unconscious as like blind libido, and where I have a big fault with that is, or big issue with that is, the idea we're trying to push is that the body is extremely intelligent. It is the most intelligent thing. So it is the hardware. And then you have this consciousness, which is kind of like the software. And your ego or narrative self is kind of like a virtual machine running on the hardware. So it's only possible, like this conscious conversation we're having is only possible because we have this unconscious substrate that is allowing this virtual machine to run. And, when this hardware gets overworked and, just not stressed out, but like actually it is kind of stressed out, you drop into a flow state. So you're no longer able to process the moment at like in the way that you normally could. So your sense of self disappears, your sense of time disappears, action and awareness merge into one. You become one with whatever activity you're doing. So, these parts of your brain that normally are active, like your ego or your narrative self, aka the default mode network, those start to wink out of existence, and then you're left with what really is driving the show, which is like this unconscious thing. And the conscious self is a luxury, if you could call it that. This inner critic is a luxury, and that's a weird thing to think about.
That
And in the same vein as contrasting to flow states, you could view depression as over processing. We kind of sometimes use the term buffering, where you're stuck in anxiety, you're ruminating on thoughts, you're ruminating on the past, you're ruminating on the future, instead of focusing on the now and falling into the flow of it. And your thoughts kind of get jumbled and you can't process them, and sort of falls into the spinning wheel of death on a computer.
amazing. Okay, so that is a lot. That's a brilliant intro to where you guys are at.
Okay.
But there's a lot to unpack there. So let's start by saying, despite the criticisms of Freud, he clearly loved his mother.
Maybe a bit too much.
I can just imagine her boasting about how proud she was of her son and his works. Oh, really? What's it about? Oh, it's complicated. So.
Yeah. Oh my god.
I mean, there's a fascinating theory that perhaps Freud was describing the repressions that Victorians were going through. Right, like maybe that was true for that era, right, of that incredibly repressive society. But there's this really fascinating idea then that got me excited, that your unconscious isn't less, right? It's not lesser. It's not your reptilian brain, as some evolutionary psychologists would say. It's not your Freudian rage, incestual id. But it's just a different way of processing, a valid way of processing. Before we get too much into that, I just want to start with the idea that the flow state, because you described how, if you're struggling with your other things, your flow state can take over. But I'd say so far, my understanding of the flow state has been when you're at your peak of consciousness, right? Like it's like, how do you get to your flow state? Like it's a meditational, not nirvana, but one of the stages on the way there to achieve as a goal.
Exactly.
But
But even pointing to it as being meditational, kind of showing it's not on the ego level, right? At least in meditation, that's the part of your thinking that you're trying to silence.
Exactly. Suppress the
control
default
better.
mode network is what you're trying to do. And so, I guess when I was saying struggle, flow states tend to happen when you're sufficiently matched to the challenge at hand. So it can't be so much, because then it produces anxiety. If you're not skilled enough, then you're going to get anxious about snowboarding downhill. But if you have enough skill, like a 60-40 between skill and challenge, then, it's enough to drop you into a flow state where, well, I've already described it. But
yeah, no, it's perfect. And I think anyone that's kind of vaguely familiar with meditation has sort of felt, these moments as they start to learn, and for good reason. Often the best book on meditation is often described as Zen and the Art of Archery, and I feel that very much. Like if I ever play pool, like if I overthink, I'm gonna miss the shot. If I don't think, I'm gonna miss the shot. But if I'm in that just right Goldilocks zone, I cannot miss a shot. It just feel like, and no, you might not be great at pool, but everyone has this with something, right? Everyone has this with a skill where they just know there's this. You've learned it enough that you don't have to overthink in order to achieve it, and suddenly you just feel this mastery, and it comes from. Feels like it's somewhere else, right?
Yes, exactly.
Odd feeling.
And some of that could also be rooted in your body knows more than your brain does. And if you trust that your body knows that action, knows how to line up that shot, knows exactly how much force to put into it, and you stop thinking about it, then you fall into flow.
Yeah, you don't need to control everything, and that's what the ego wants to do. It wants to control and get involved in everything, but sometimes you need to do what meditation does, which is silence that, put it out, just perceive instead of trying to think about everything.
So in regards to that, I saw a video where you quoted the research that I thought was very interesting about your body knowing things ahead of your conscious mind knowing things. Could you maybe elaborate?
Oh yeah,
The gaming test?
sure. The Iowa gambling test. Just review that again.
Yeah.
Okay. So there's this study called the Iowa Gambling Task where, it's done with a researcher and a participant. And, they sometimes do this online, with video, but we'll just say it's in person. So the researcher will set out 4 decks of cards, and then the participant is told not the rules of the game, but just to start drawing from the decks of cards and win as much money as possible. So the participants start pulling from the decks randomly, and, sometimes their money goes up, sometimes it goes down. They have no idea what's happening. They're just pulling cards. So what happens is, after about 10, I should also preface this. The participants are also hooked up to a galvanic skin response. So it's kind of like a lie detector that measures the sweat glands in their skin and how much they're, perspiring. So what happens is after about 10 cards, the body starts to sweat when the participant starts to pull from the wrong decks. But about 10 or 20 cards later, that's when the conscious self says, oh, I know which deck it is. It's deck A. Deck A is the bad deck, or deck B is the good deck. So what that tells us is, the researchers are noticing that the GSR, the galvanic skin response, is going up, whenever they're pulling from the wrong deck. So, this puts, I guess, the idea that our physiology always plays a part in our decision making, even when we think it's all top-down logic. I'm the one that decided this is the good deck. But really, your body was helping you the entire time. You just didn't realize it. And what meditation does for me is help bridge that gap. So you're always in a relationship between what you know and what you don't know. So between your conscious self, what you're consciously aware of, and what your unconscious is trying to tell you, or your body.
A quantum psychological state, right?
Yeah. And that's your eternal situation, that it always knows more than you. Yeah. It organizes all of your perceptions. This is done unconsciously, and then we get to experience the moment 500 milliseconds behind reality. Yeah. And
we get the synthesis.
Yeah, we get the synthesis, and we think we're doing it, but and in some ways we are. It's just not a part of ourselves that's conscious. And so, yeah. Did you want to jump on?
I'm gonna be a terrible podcast host there because I have no pushback to give. That just all intuitively makes sense to me, right? We very much.
That's good.
In terms of our instincts, it just absolutely makes sense that, you've got this big brain, right? The biggest of any species ever, in proportion to our body mass. Incredibly hard to think and calculate and run the maths, right?
Yeah.
And most of our ancestors would not survive if there wasn't an instinct. And I've seen this replicated in many, many studies. When you put people in a social game, playing with people, they work out within 2-3 iterations whether they trust the person or not, way before they have a rationalization for it, way before they have the data to back it up. But people with about 90+% accuracy can work out whether someone is likely to cooperate or betray them in a social cooperation game, right? And they'll do that, in 2 rounds of the game, or in the best case within 15 seconds of meeting the person. There's just many studies where our instincts are just superior, and you look at things like driving, right? We would not be able to drive if it had to be done based on actually doing the calculations, right? We've seen this. Physicists worked out that in order for David Beckham to kick his free kicks, the spinning free kicks, he must be doing 14 physics equations at the same time. Like David Beckham, nice guy, but no one has ever accused him of doing 14 physics equations simultaneously. But the unconscious brain handles it quite well, right?
Yeah. No, David Eagleman, I was reading a book of his, and he's a neuroscientist, and he was talking about how they were measuring baseball players and like when they would run to go catch something. And so, they're having to do some sort of calculus in order to figure out where the ball is going to go, but the body isn't doing that. The conscious self isn't doing that. It's not actually doing calculus, but the body is saying like, you need to run faster, slow down. But it's not down there probably like with a pen and paper, okay, triangle.
There's not time, right?
There isn't. So it's interesting to think.
I mean, it almost gets into conspiracy theories and paranormal stuff, because I am not into that, but I don't like to discredit it. I think Jung, right, so Freud's predecessor said, predecessor? No, the other one.
Colleague.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, colleague.
So look, it's not very scientific to dismiss something out of hand just because it sounds kooky, right? Every conspiracy theory at some point, could or may be proved, right? Edward Snowden proved that the government is indeed listening to everything we say.
Yeah, they do.
And so I think things like the instinct when you walk in a room. Things like when you walk into a room and get a bad vibe, right? Like, I don't believe in ghosts, personally. But I could understand someone that has the instinct that something horrific happened here. Maybe it's trace smell of blood or like something. But yeah, the subconscious picks up on useful cues way quicker than the conscious ever could.
Yeah. So one thing I think that's kind of interesting is that if you think about, these are going to be predictions and estimations, but every second we're streaming in about 11 million bits of information into our body, coming in through all of our sense organs. And the conscious self is only capable of processing around 200 bits of information per second. So that's an extreme bottleneck. 11 million funneled into 200, and that's what the story that your conscious, this synthesis of sensory information is happening with just 200 bits. And so I mean, it just goes to tell you, like, in order to shrink down 11 million bits into 200, it's just the need to know information, and it isn't happening in real time. The conscious experience that you're having right now is 500 milliseconds behind reality,
because that's how long it takes your brain to process that synthesis.
Yeah, it has to process all this stuff
at least 500 milliseconds, right? Because with the card was shown even maybe 20 moves later, which could be quite a bit of a delay. But there has to be some kind of benefit to this very filtered, self-critical, rational mind as well, right? Why did we develop it? Right? Because we can think, okay, the flow state is the best state. I think, a bird, for example, flying around is probably right inside of the flow state at that point. But we as humans evolved, a little step further than that, of course. Is it really all useless?
No.
Should we just be more like animals? And
I mean, that's the idea that, like, okay, aren't you both Buddhists or into that sort of thing?
Yeah.
Okay. So, the idea that the Buddha came up with, I guess, is like, I'm not special. We all have Buddha consciousness. We all have this capability of Buddhahood. And he's just the guy who woke up and realized he was that. And we're all capable of that. We're all, and so, a bird is kind of in that Buddha nature all the time. But as human beings like us, we have this conscious self that gets in the middle of things, and it's like, it's a necessary thing for us to have an ego to help navigate this social environment that we live in. It's very complex. We need this sort of thing. We need to stand back from the immediacy of the world sometimes, and the ego allows us to do that. But when you start to really look into what the ego is, it's a product of thought, and thought is ultimately a product of time. So without time, thought couldn't exist. And so like the point is, it's like, you know, this 500 milliseconds behind reality, that is what you're consciously experiencing. And you need that, but you need it ultimately to adjudicate between conflicting instinctual drives. So, you know, we're not just philosophical zombies or, you know, robots, because robots can't, they're going to get stuck in a corner like the first generation of Roombas. So like we have, so like, you know, so we have this instinct adjudication system, which I call consciousness. And that's what helps us get out of a jam. And it isn't that we have less instincts now than we did 6 million years ago. It's that we have more instincts. And I think that idea originally came from William James.
William James, for
that guy was
those that don't know, like the OG psychologist, he pointed out that everyone's got it twisted, right? Everyone's got it flipped. People think that they wake up, someone's mean to you, then you're in a bad mood. Whereas in fact, it's more likely to be the converse. You wake up in a bad mood, you have an interaction with someone, you perceive it very negatively, right? Like, and so yeah, he described the human condition as you have these emotions and then you look for a rationalization post hoc, right?
Yeah. Yeah. And so we're always confabulating and telling ourselves stories, telling stories about what other people are doing based on, you know, our knowledge of our own body and our own behaviors. So that's theory of mind. I'm looking at you and I'm like, you know, because I know how I interact with my body, like I know that, you know, like you might be thirsty right now because you're looking for a glass of water, and you just, you know, it's like,
It's always wine, don't worry.
All right. So he's like, all right, this guy's talking too much. So I'm like, all right, I need to pull out, you know? So it's like these little cues tell us, and maybe I'm making up a story that's false and maybe it's right. You know, that's the game of consciousness right there.
Fascinating.
Humans are pattern-seeking creatures, and there's our tendency, of course, to see patterns and faces and things where they don't exist. We impose our own sort of narrative
Yes.
on the world.
And
So that makes
psychedelics,
quite
if
a
you're
lot
not
of
aware,
sense.
kind of increase, not kind of, they increase pattern recognition. So you get in this heightened state of pattern recognition. And that's an interesting state. I don't know if you guys have sampled that before.
Gotcha. I mean,
Oh, yeah.
it's
Oh, yeah.
why I love mushrooms, right? Like, because you just
right.
suddenly become more aware of the patterns in the wild. And what an experience. A trip, that is, literally.
So a good,
Now we disconnected. Hold on a second. Why is that happening?
I don't know. I think it might be because I'm trying to record locally.
It's the CIA cutting us down. They can't handle our truth.
I know, it's too much.
I'm sure they were doing it with the best of intentions.
Yeah.
Well, except the CIA were dosing everybody and anybody with LSD. They even had
I mean, once you become the world's biggest coke
You know,
dealers, like
if you
might
read about
as
MK
well-
Ultra, like you want to interpret it as this like horrifying, you know, mind control experiment, which it was. But like more than that, it almost struck me
Get
more
into
of
the
like this
acid
frat
game, too.
boys, sort of an example of like, here, smell this. Like
There's
it's like,
this
here,
famous video as well. I don't think it's the American, it's the British, I think, who gave it to their military. And there's all these officers in the field, just chilling out, laughing with each other, rolling around, and
Climbing trees.
Didn't really work for that, did it?
Yeah, they wanted to use it as a mind control thing, but it's just too unpredictable. They were trying to weaponize LSD, and it just
It frees your mind.
right?
Yeah,
If anything, it's the opposite, right? Like very hard to control a mind on LSD.
exactly
Even more dangerous, though.
right.
people were like, oh, you know, what did they learn? Did they learn something? You know, and if I'm not mistaken, I think they learned that if you hurt a person long enough and mess with them long enough, you can break them. But I mean, you can learn that from just like hitting them with a stick.
We're getting somewhat off tangent, but I love it. But
Well, it's because I dropped some LSD before coming in. No. Yeah, no.
But so in regards to psychedelics, right? Don't you find as well that it kind of sort of unfilters this rational mind that is very specific in its filtering? So when I do acid, suddenly I notice way more bits of information than I would usually notice, and the flow of information starts to become a lot more broader and less narrowly filtered.
Yes.
We would attribute
sort of
that
your
to the
traditional
disintegration
patterns.
of the default mode network. And basically, we attribute the default mode network, you can consider it the editor of the mind. It is the thing that basically takes those 11 million bits and pares it down to the 200.
It's part of that process.
part of that
so
process.
you're describing, what people that love hallucinogens describe as ego death, right?
Yes, but it doesn't have to be a full ego death. And so I guess to pick up a little bit on what she was talking about, all right, so when you take a substance like LSD or psilocybin, it helps your brain, the two hemispheres of your brain, connect and talk to each other in ways that they don't normally. So it becomes hyper connected, but then the default mode network becomes more disintegrated. So your ego self starts to wink out of existence and you start to drop into more flow states. I mean, that's why time seems to go so slow. Like 8 hours on a trip feels way longer than that. And you can drop into an experience of infinity, which you're wearing an infinity wave shirt. You have an infinity behind you. Like you must get it, apparently.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense as well, as that our perception of time is very much a conscious thing, right? Like it's minute by minute thinking, processing, computation. And so when you mess with that, that is what breaks the space-time psychic continuum.
Yeah. The neuroscientist... Oh, sorry.
No, I was just going to say, I struggle with ADD, and as a result, I don't normally notice the passage of time. Like, it's, I can, be looking... in a good state of flow, I start writing, and then, suddenly it's 7 hours later, and I've got a whole comic done. Other times, I stare at a crack on the wall for like 45 minutes, and it feels like 5.
Yeah.
And that even gets heightened on psychedelics. Now, obviously, as an anarchist, doing drugs is illegal, and I would never do anything illegal ever for any reason. But if I did, I found that, it's very interesting because, like, as a Buddhist, I am, trying to meditate to reach a certain state of satori, which involves ego death. But also, like, it feels like one of the things that I would do is, I think the kids call it candy flipping, where you mix in LSD and Molly, and that's freaking phenomenal, and my life has been so much better because I did that a few times. But what was very interesting on it was I reached sort of a false satori at one point where
this is what I've heard. Like a Buddhist monk described it to me as you can reach the levels that people are attempting with meditation via drugs, but it's cheating, it's speed running, it's
sneaking
glitching,
into
it's
the
hacking
temple.
it.
It's sneaking into the temple, and then also like because you're sneaking in, it changes like the experience.
That was your cue to argue, Meleng. I knew that would trigger you.
But is it really no? But is it really because the Buddha held up a flower and Nanda became enlightened, right? There's the whole passage of the direct transmission of mind. There's no effort you need to do to become enlightened.
Yeah, you just have to realize it.
You are already enlightened. There's no achievable element here. So with psychedelics or no psychedelic doesn't matter, right?
And it helps show you the path, but many different things can show you the path. Like in the book we just finished, there's discussion of psychedelics, but there's discussion of meditation, there's discussion of
sensory deprivation.
They're all tools, right?
Once you find the tool that works for you to get there, then you don't always need to use the tool. Like, yes, we have used psychedelics to get there, but once you know the pathway, you can get there without them.
And
so the closest I have to this is I accidentally achieved a transcendental out-of-body state.
Yes. Okay, cool.
I was trying to free dive, right? And so in order to free dive, you just need to meditate, clear your mind, slow down your heart, think of nothing, completely relax. And I just suddenly had this fucking experience where first I was out of my body, and then I wasn't my body. I was the valley I was in. I was the lake. I was the... I went, cool. Heart rate slowed down, dive down to the bottom of this lake, and at no point felt like I was in my body during that whole experience. Went up there and described it, and every Buddhist I talked to goes, that's what we spend months working for. You accidentally did it, and I'm like, but surprisingly, like they said, accidentally isn't surprising because it's really hard when you go on this 1 month Buddhist meditation retreat and everyone's trying to out Buddhist each other. The ego gets in the way, right?
Yeah.
Get the high score, right? I have the least ego of all of you.
The high score.
I am the most connected with everything. But yeah, that's the oceanic feeling. Now, when you were diving, were you skin diving? Were you?
Yeah. This is just me and my swimming trunks in a
Yeah,
lake.
because that's known to happen to skin divers at certain depths. I think one famous Buddhist said that Satori is like regular life, just 2 inches off the ground. So actually, if oftentimes when people do go down to those depths, they feel like the release of the standard gravity that's always on their body, and that can lead to the oceanic feeling. So.
You one with the pressure at 40 meters, you get nitrogen narcosis and start to get drunk. So.
Sometimes far enough down, they're known to sometimes take off their mask and offer it to a fish. Here.
Yeah, I've seen that.
Yeah, I've heard that from Alan Watts. Yeah.
Oh, Alan Watts is phenomenal.
I watched my sister literally do that. And
Really?
yeah.
She's still around, right?
incredible.
She made it.
Yeah, thankfully.
Okay.
Yeah. And the fishes too.
I was gonna say, did the fish accept?
You'll be glad to. No, the fish swam away. So
Alan Watts I encountered him at like just the exact perfect time in my life, because I had been doing, I had been doing LSD for a little while. I had become very involved in my Buddhist organization, which is Soka Gakkai. And I was reading Daisaku Ikeda's Unlocking the Mysteries of Birth and Death, and I found a quote from Alan Watts. And I was just, it hit me. And I was like, oh my gosh, this is so incredible. I'll have to look up this guy. And I totally forgot about it. And then, like, I'd say maybe 6 months later, I get a YouTube recommendation to listen to one of his lectures, and light went on. Like, because I had the Buddhist background, I was able to understand what he was saying in a way that I probably would not have if I'd encountered him in, say, 2010,
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
What I really like about Alan Watts is that he had a really good synthesis between the Western scientific understanding of reality and the Eastern Buddhist understanding of reality, right? So,
Exactly.
for example, he could really link the Big Bang story, right? Okay, so we're all just stardust originating in the Big Bang, right? It's just illusionary evolution of time in between there and right now, but it's all just sequential. One line in between there, right? Every atom that we are is just a star exploding and creating heavier and heavier atoms that started to coalesce. And for me, like, he's one of the first that was really able to synthesize those those two stories
to
well
explain
together.
Buddhism in a way that someone who was not raised in a country with a Buddhist background, so that we Westerners can understand what the heck they're talking about.
And maybe better even, because maybe even in the East, sort of the real core understanding of Buddhism got lost a little bit until they started to synthesis with the Westerners again.
Everything he says is just so bold and yet so obvious simultaneously, right?
Yeah, you're like, I want to disprove this, and you think about it for like 5 minutes, and you're like, no, I can't. Like,
I've been there. Yeah.
So one of the really cool things that I've found about, and this kind of goes back to what I was saying with the context of the trip, the context of the spiritual experience is extremely important to the experience itself. And so, like, I think that is why, why someone can become enlightened in an instant for any reason, but also sometimes, doing it through psychoactive drugs can feel like sneaking into the temple, because, there's a little Hintergedanke in the back of your head most of the time saying, like, I did this artificially. Whereas if you found you didn't really do it artificially, it's the same experience, but it is the feeling about the way that someone attains it that can kind of color the experience.
You can feel like you didn't do the work, but honestly you did, because from my experience with psychedelics, especially if you don't go into it with the right mindset, or if you fight it while you're in the experience, if you're not willing to do the work, that's where you get the bad trip. That's where, if you don't have the surrender, and if you're not willing to just be open and live in the moment and accept what is coming to you, if you fight it, then you start spiraling.
Yeah.
My friend called the experience the shedding of the selves, because in that moment in ego death, like all the layers of self that you think you are, all the layers of identity you think you are, like race and job and like all these things, like start to melt away, and what you're left with is this feeling of oceanic boundlessness. This universal consciousness or cosmic consciousness or Buddha consciousness or nirvana.
Which for
whatever you
some
wanna call it.
people is beautifully positive, but,
Yeah.
but for others is not. And I think Joe Rogan, for all his flaws, described it beautifully. He's like, if you smoke a bit of weed and start thinking about your life a bit deeper, and that causes a massive panic attack, the problem isn't the weed. Like, you might be living through layers and layers of denial and doubt that you have
Exactly.
not
You
processed.
You haven't done the hard,
right?
spiritual and philosophical work. No, I get you on that. What was very interesting. So, I think about the worst trip / best trip I ever had was
Okay.
I dropped about 3 hits of a brand new acid, and you never quite know what you're getting. And I decided that what I was going to do was I was going to go and see The Hobbit 2.
Oh no!
Put yourself in a
The
3-hour
worst
movie.
experience that's bad enough sober.
Finally,
Oh yeah.
someone said it.
So like, no. So I go to see this, and this is a movie that ever since The Lord of the Rings came out, I was originally training to be an actor. I was like, I need to be in that movie because it's going to be so good. And I wasn't too happy with the first installment, but I said, okay, I'll go. I'll have an experience. This is kind of my favorite part of the book.
Oh, sure. Star Wars does this to us, right? Every time we hope the next one won't be
Yeah,
as
absolutely.
disappointing.
Now, the good thing about being in The Hobbit 2 on 3 hits of acid is that it was amazing. Like, I would say for 90% of the movie, I'm sitting there and I'm like, this is the greatest movie of my life. I'm having a blast. And then they hit the human town. And like they're suddenly introduced all of these issues with like class struggle and stuff like to the world of the Hobbit, and the guy playing Bard kind of had my haircut at the time, and then like we're right before Bilbo is going to go into the dragon, and the dwarves come up and they give that line that makes sense in the normal book, which is like, you can turn back if you like, but like the way they'd added in like the sort of gravitas from the Lord of the Rings movies, you can turn back. My wife kind of, just went over and whispered in my ear. She's like, bullshit, if he turns back, they're going to kill him. And I'm like, oh my God, they are. And suddenly, I'm seeing like Bilbo like stumble around on this giant pile of gold that's, essentially looks like junk at this point. There's so much of it. And freaking Smaug comes out and suddenly it's like a dragon. And, and I'm sitting there and I'm looking at this and I'm like, oh my God, I'm going to permafry and I'm going to come out a guy obsessed with Lord of the Rings, forgetting that that's just me normally. Anyway, the point of this is we leave and I'm in like the weirdest freaking place in New York. The theater was, it's got like giant pharaoh heads and stuff on the wall. We get home to my apartment and I go in, kind of, me and my wife sort of do our best to calm down and set like a good, mood. And then suddenly I am back in we're back in the bedroom and I no longer exist. And it is eternity from the beginning to the end. I'm not myself. My wife is not herself. We are just two beings that have existed and always existed. And from the beginning to the end, it's, are you okay? Yes, I'm okay. Are you okay? Yes, I'm okay. I love you. I love you. Back for eternity. Like, and of course, it wasn't for eternity. Eternity then ended, and I came out of that trip. But the experience, that level of shedding the ego death unexpectedly, what I was really struck by was that essentially I wound up reaching a point where there was almost total disintegration of the self. There was only, moving into a more dualistic place, but also ultimately, even with all the crazy stuff that like had informed the trip, ultimately when I got to that point, it was an incredibly beautiful thing. And so I always really will treasure that experience. And also, I am mad at you, Peter Jackson.
So this is the point where I apologize to the Nelsons because this is actually an unsolicited therapy session. So over to you. Please diagnose Brent.
I mean, there's no diagnosis. I'm just an artist who.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I mean, you had the transcendent or mystical type experience. I have had that experience over 40 times, and because it happened to me so many times, with and without the help of psychedelics, I was like, all right, I have to write this down so other people that have never tried any psychedelic, any drug ever, can connect to what it means to say we are one with everything. We are one with nature. Because you hear that when you're like, for me, you hear that as like a 24-year-old and you're like, the hell, that sounds woo-woo, that sounds weird. Like, I have no connection to that. I believe in science, I'm an atheist, but then, I had an experience when I was 25 that, just like you had, that same sort of experience, and it showed me, okay, let's dissolve all your religious certainties. Let's melt off the story you think you are and show you who you can be. Like, this is the path you're on, and it's a horrible path. And this is the shadow that you're hiding from yourself. These are all the horrible, like, patterns of behavior that are taking you down. And do you still want to do this? And I mean, of course it's uncomfortable. It was, you said it was like your worst, best trip.
Absolutely.
Right? Or your favorite.
I mean, it's not my,
Yeah.
I have a favorite, but yeah, my worst, best trip would be right there.
I mean,
'Cause it's
but
uncomfortable.
tying together a few threads here.
Yeah,
like,
please.
It's very clear that we all know the people that did hard drugs just because they were drunk and in a bad mood. And the hallucinogens are probably the worst. Like, I'm never surprised when someone's like, I was in a terrible mood and I expanded my mind, and would you believe it didn't go well?
Well, one thing he said is it was unexpected, right? You weren't expecting to dissolve on this particular trip, and that's where it can come in. Like, you'll hear the term set and setting, or you'll hear the term psychedelic container, and also sourcing. Setting and sourcing are very important, just kind of knowing what you have going into it and setting some kind of intention. If you are just going in, like, I feel like when our experiences together are always slightly different, like he generally, well, sometimes you do want to find the edge, but he more often wants to have the fun with it. I'm kind of always looking for the edge. It's a problem. Actually, it's not a problem.
Is it a problem?
It's educational. It's not at all.
I don't know if
actually.
it's a problem. Yeah.
Yeah, and
It's very interesting because if you look at tribal societies, I don't think there's a concept such as bad tripping there.
yeah,
Their whole
it's-
set and setting is so oriented towards having this psychedelic experience, especially to go, for example, from a youngster to an adult. And I don't even think they have a concept really of
Yeah, no.
a
It's
bad
kind of just
trip.
all.
It's just
It's just all about like what will the medicine show me.
yeah,
Exactly.
Yeah, and it's like when you get to a point in your life where you're okay with nightmares, right? Like even a nightmare is a learning experience and an interesting experience. Like for me, my worst nightmares became my trigger for lucid dreaming, and that just flipped how I thought about things. Rather than going to bed and hoping for a pleasant dream, you're like, either way, right? It is what it is. Like, it is to be savored, learnt from an experience. So
Because it is your unconscious processing, and even if especially if it's a terrible dream, there must be something in your waking life that you haven't confronted.
But
Yeah.
does this
Might
does
need
it not
to
apply
address,
to
yeah.
everything? That is just
yeah,
life is life. The experience
was
of
that
life
not
is
Buddha?
whatever you
Buddha's
get,
lesson to
and-
us,
and
right?
yeah,
Like
it's-
life is suffering.
yeah.
right?
It's just there to experience, right?
Don't avoid it. Don't shy away from
I
it.
can't even disagree with some of what you said earlier. That like the spiritual struggle or the spiritual path and the spiritual growth, is there really, or is that just experience? It doesn't really.
Yeah, the
like-
problem with growth is it implies again a high score,
Yeah.
right? A destination to be reached.
Yeah.
Right. And
And
masters
same for
to be
nature. I
followed.
think there's also like a fallacy of feeling like Buddha resides in the beautiful of nature. I really like Robert Pirsig, the author of Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance. There's a really great quote where he says that the Buddha resides just as comfortably in the hardware of a computer, say for example, as it would in the leaves of a lotus flower.
Well,
Right.
you know, it's
It's-
interesting that you bring up the figure of a lotus, the symbol of a lotus, because that's one of the key symbols for my sect. You know, and of course, our most venerated sutra is the Lotus Sutra. And you think about the lotus flower. You know, it's this beautiful flower that opens in the sun and closes when it gets cold, and it tends to grow in like dark, dank, muddy water, where it can sink its
Exactly,
roots.
yeah.
You know, so you know, what is the truth of the Buddha? Is it the roots and the mud, or is it the flower? It's both, and you can't really have one without the other. You can't have a lotus flower without the muddy water for it to sink its roots.
Yes.
So I feel like the other really cool thing about the lotus as a symbol is that the lotus both flowers and seeds at the same time. And that was like one of the hardest concepts for me to get within Buddhism, is the simultaneity of cause and effect, because we tend to think linearly, and you're thinking about like in a more primitive understanding of karma and a more primitive understanding of time. But, as we, beyond like just Buddhist and Hindu philosophy, modern scientists at this point tend to believe that time is not actually linear. We only experience it linear, and in reality, all times happen at once. So, I feel like in the same way as like, the Upanishads in some ways perfectly describe what would be considered, the Big Bang, a lot of the sutras perfectly describe, like in a slightly different way, what we're thinking about with modern quantum physics and how time, acts on the world. Yeah, so, I guess what I would say is, overall, it's interesting to get at things from a scientific perspective, but also from a mystical perspective. There's value in seeing it as both at once.
Exactly.
And to bring it back to our quantum psychology, that is the conscious and the subconscious, the instinct and however you want to define your terms, right? And just pragmatically, I've known moments in my life where I've made a decision that has instinctually made sense and logically made sense, and that is the ultimate flow state. Like that's when Steve Jobs describes you're surfing the wave, right? You feel you're flowing with the universe rather than against it.
Because if you're
when you're in line,
because if you're trying to protect yourself and make sure that everything goes your way, that's that's where all the problems come from. Guys, I'm getting this idea that perhaps desire and an expectation of things going a certain way and wanting to impose that on the world causes problems. Perhaps desire, and if we release desire, we release that idea, that will make things, much easier and much better. Original idea, don't steal.
I've never heard that before.
Could I push back on
like
that though? Because no, could I push back on that though? Because I don't know, maybe I'm just privileged white male living my best life, but I feel like I'm simultaneously in my flow state and getting everything I want from the universe. And is desire so bad?
It's not. Well,
so
no, I've been talking long enough. Jay, explain.
Yeah, let's go to the Nelsons. Yeah, go for it.
All right, I want to give you my explanation of what nirvana is. So nirvana is that it's not a physical place. It's a place in your mind. So it's a mental summer home that you can accidentally stumble into sometimes. And it's that place where you're untouched by fear and desire, where you tap into a moment of selflessness, timelessness, and it's characterized by feelings of oceanic boundlessness. So just to unpack that a little bit, it's fear and desire, so it's thought that keeps us out of infinity or eternity. So nirvana is an experience where it's outside of time in some sort of like liminal space. And so, but it is your desire to want to do something, to move. Choice and movement is the engine of consciousness. But if you want to step outside of this localized consciousness that you have and experience something that's more like disembodied consciousness, which feels infinite, because remember, your body organizes all your perceptions and calculates time for you. Time is calculated inside the prefrontal cortex, but when you tap into these flow states, it's called transient hypofrontality, coined by neuroscientist Arne Dietrich. And so, parts of your prefrontal cortex wink out, right? And so you're not able to calculate time. And so that's how people tap into this experience of timelessness and selflessness, obviously, because like I was saying, the self is underpinned by the network, the default mode network. And when that winks out of existence, then you have the selflessness. So you take all those things in together: timelessness, selflessness, oceanic boundlessness. So the oceanic boundlessness, you have a part of your brain that is putting edges to things, like there's a laptop here and there's books
Smoothing
here.
out a wiggly
but
world.
the way that it's exactly, it's smoothing it out. It's there's so much layers of the vision that are inside your head and not being perceived. So you perceive one unified visual field. And so if that part of your brain gets offlined with, maybe a flow state or maybe a psychedelic or something like that, you're going to perceive the wall being one with you and you being one with the couch and the chair and the laptop and everything, or whatever you're looking at, or your wife, you know what I mean? Like, it's this part of your brain that can get switched off. And when it does, that's when we tap into these moments that we call nirvana or
right. So just how we think it's cool when we, like, are fearless, right? Like, in the face of fear, we are fearless. It is also beneficial to be as unfazed by a positive experience, right? Like, if something's bad, this will pass. If something's good, this too will pass.
Yeah.
I mean, we have a concept in Soka Gakkai, which is the 10 worlds. This predates both my sect. It's a major Buddhist concept, but it's essentially like the 10 life conditions, like where your head is at any given time. And this runs the gamut all the way from hell and hungry ghosts all the way up to the world of humans, to the world of asuras, and finally to the worlds of bodhisattva and Buddha. And what's very important is the concept of Ichinen Sanzen, which is translated roughly into English as 10,000 things in a single moment of life. And what's important is to understand is that each of the 10 worlds contains the other 9 within it. So at any point, you can be a Buddha. You can move from hell to the Buddha state. And you can move from humanity to the state of the asuras or whatever. Again, it is like how our minds as an individual consciousness interact with the reality around us. Ultimately, there is no difference between these two things. Now, what I wanted to add to that, because you mentioned earlier about desire, it's important to understand that with desire, the concept is the word they actually use is tanha, not desire. It means essentially thirst in the most destructive way that you can imagine it. I've explained this as, if everybody remembers that picture of Ivanka Trump looking at the very handsome Canadian Prime Minister, you look at that and you're like, oh, that girl is thirsty. It is not so much, Chris, that desire is a bad thing. It is, the kind of extreme desire that is rooted in the illusion that we are just ourselves and nothing else that causes us problems. Buddhism is in a lot of ways a dialectical process. And so, in much the same way that you need to learn to accept the world as it is and your connection to it, you also need to learn to accept that you will never totally eliminate desire.
So if hedonism is the result to your sadness, there is some deeper digging to be done.
Yeah. I mean, it's really fascinating because what we're talking about essentially is something that is universal at the core of human experience. Everyone has some inkling of it, but also because the nature of being an individual consciousness involves this thing called I. It's something that can't be completely shed, and even if you do try consciously to shed it, well, that's, as we said earlier, the biggest ego trip is chasing after ego death. So you've really got to get yourself to that state of consciousness, not just with meditation. It involves threading a very specific needle, but once you get there, the experience is kind of like, oh, you son of a bitch, I was here already.
Exactly. Can I layer on a couple things?
Please do. Yeah.
So, ultimately there's two modes of the brain. It's like thinking and perception. So when you are in a meditative state, what you're trying to do is not think. You're trying to think about nothing, right? So you're just trying to perceive reality. And so like one thing I love to do is have like a noisy fan on in the background. And so I'm just trying to appreciate the perfection of that fan. And if I can just listen with like 100% of my being, I am being and perception. Because that is what being is. Existence is perception, and perception is existence. You wouldn't know what existence was if you weren't able to perceive, and there couldn't be existence if there wasn't something to perceive it. So what you're trying to do is get into that spot where you're untouched by desire, you're untouched by a thought, You're untouched by any fear. You're not trying to move. So nirvana is that place of ultimate centeredness and stillness. And when you find that place where you're not moving internally or externally, that's when you realize the entire world is moving, because the entire being, the entire being perception cycle is this never-ending, evolving being perception cycle. I mean, that's just, it's hard to not have a circular definition there, but that is kind of what it is. But then you tap into selflessness or anatman, you know? You tap into that
Emptiness.
moment that you are everything. You aren't this I, you are, you're, and then that's Satchitananda, the being consciousness, true bliss. You tap into that.
I think also, Chris, because you mentioned hedonism, right? The problem I think with hedonism is that it's a very shaky relationship with desire, right? Because it's so short-term based, and I think that's what you easily see with around you in just in real life, is that people that do really dig into the hedonism get rich as much as they want to get rich. It's never enough to satiate those desires.
You can
So
drop.
it's a very unstable relationship you have with that phenomenon.
Oh, yeah.
of desire.
It's kind of
Yeah,
always
but what
looking.
what if you're really good at hedonism?
Yeah.
Maybe.
I mean, the Buddha. The
But like
Buddha
with all
spent
things,
quite
it's
a
You
kind
might
of-
be the
Buddha
exception.
spent quite a lot of time being hedonistic, and I'm somewhat of the mind that exploring the worlds of pleasure and earthly desires, that is part of the journey. It's again, it's you. The big problem is that one of the 6 lower worlds, the 6 evil paths, and in the 10 worlds, is heaven. And heaven is the realm of desire fulfilled, where you've gotten that thing that you want, whatever it is. You've gotten the promotion, you've gotten the career, you've gotten, the great sex or wonderful, perfect food. But because of how our brains work, we are not motivated to find that fulfilling for very long. And pretty soon you will drop back down into one of the lower 6 worlds. So if somebody is in heaven, chasing after that one experience to another, pretty soon you're going to find you're going to drop down into the realm of hungry ghosts, which is,
So that's a wonderful thought that the Western concept of heaven is a Buddhist concept of a lower realm that needs to be escaped. I'm going to hand over to Mrs. Nelson because like a few times you've come in to say something.
Oh.
I think I was going to comment on the idea of, well, basically just both fear and desire pull you out of the now moment, and nirvana is living in the now and in the perception. So both fear and desire pull you away from that. And actually, what you were saying about, was it the 10,000 worlds?
10,000
lives?
realms in a single moment of existence.
That's actually pretty much exactly what I went through on our last journey. I will preface with, we live in the state of Colorado, and Prop 122 just passed, so natural medicines are legal now. Certain
Hard to
ones.
control math.
Congratulations, yeah. I wish I'd lived there now, actually. Yeah.
There's some language in there that could be debated, but it's a step forward. So,
Yeah.
anyways, so leaving
Better
with
than
that,
Amsterdam.
yeah. So what basically where I ended up was it was probably a 6 or 7 hour experience where I couldn't. It's not that I couldn't form sentences. I was kind of babbling. He would say it was babble, because I was living in every moment at the same time. And by the time I would formulate a thought that I could speak, I had already moved on to 10,000 more moments. So we were in a social setting. There were hundreds of people around. I wanted to interact, but then I discovered I can't. So I'm just going to stay silent. I'm going to perceive. I'm going to make it my goal to just absorb as much as I can and remember as much as I can, and just live in nirvana and perceive as much as I can. And how would you describe my babbling?
It was weird. It was like she was talking into the wind, and the wind always took her words. I couldn't understand what she was saying. And, she's a very smart person, so, it was strange. But, we took acid, we took 2CE, and we took some MDMA that night. So,
And I remember every moment of it. We were at a concert. I remember every show. I remember every thought I was trying to say. But then I was just like, okay, the thoughts, you're moving on to the next moment. And not even, and it wasn't even moving on, because implies still some sort of form of linear time, I described it more as wormholes. It was a night of wormholes. I was just in one continuous wormhole, living every moment at once and absorbing it.
And so I think to close it, like, I think what we need is we need that ego self that helps us partition time, because without it, that's when time gets very chaotic, you know? Dr. Robin Carhart Harris has a theory about like the entropic brain and how, like, you know, the way that these psychedelics help with healing mental disorders and that sort of thing is because it increases the amount of brain entropy in the system for a temporary bit of time, and then, you know, it settles back. Like water will always seek the lowest level. You know, your neurons start to connect in ways that they weren't previously, and it's like defragging and or like Tetris, like, and then
but it's so true.
Yeah.
What this strikes me.
So she was experiencing entropy.
No.
I
mean, what this strikes me as is very interesting, and I don't know if this was exactly the experience in the moment, but, you know, let's remember that our language, the words that we use, you know, are symbolic, and really, the sounds that I'm saying right now have no inherent essential content. It's, you know, it's stitched together by our ability to recognize a particular symbol. In that moment when you were trying to speak and trying to express yourself, what was happening was that you were creating symbols that were not tied specifically to where you were. What's really interesting about that is you think about the Nietzschean concept of living one's life as a work of art. In a moment like that, I think honestly, when you can't connect rational words, the answer really is to sing. Because what you're doing is, you know, you are essentially generating art in like the most artistic sense, because there's no motivation for profit there. There's no motivation to persuade someone of anything. Instead, like what you've got in that moment is you are simply expressing your reality as it is, and it moves into kind of, again, like music. And I think that
sing or dance.
That's beautiful.
Yeah, no, I thought the
For
same
me,
thing.
it's
It reminds me of musicals, right? Like when the characters are too emotional to speak, they start dancing, and when they're too emotional, they start singing. And
Well, what I discovered in the moment was that I would get hung up if I tried to speak because I was trying to latch on to one moment, because all moments were passing through, and I was trying to kind of pull one out of the everything.
It's a fast-flowing river. Yeah, it matches my experience so intensely. This combination of ego death, right? So I remember people asking me questions and just turning them and being like, I get it. You want to speak to Chris? But I've just sidestepped Chris like a matador and a bull right now. Don't make me jump back on the bull. That's what's happening. And in hindsight, like, it really is true. And this is, you know, why I have great fun with hallucinogens, because I'm not going to do them 100 times in my life. You know, I'm very selective. Right time, right place, right people, right mood. Right, like all the alignments have to happen. And so because of them, they've always been a semi-religious experience where, yeah, I have just honestly, like, leveled up, like killed something.
It was not a
that
competition,
wrong.
Chris. Remember?
I know, but at the same point, it's hard not to think of myself as better than before. Like, and especially, you know, speaking plainly, frankly, I was a very socially unaware 19-year-old, right? Like, I really hadn't had many friends. I hadn't made many connections. Like, mostly because I was just desperately playing this game of, like, please love me. Hey, everyone, please love me. And so I was always insecure, always weird in social interactions, always failed. Like, it's just this converse paradox. The harder you try to make people love you, the more weirded out they are, right? And I just needed to kill some levels of ego before people were prepared to accept me, and I was prepared to accept myself. Right, and so it's hard to not think of that as leveling up.
So what?
Really?
It doesn't matter. But I like Robert Pirsig has this way of dividing reality from, of course, the core. Everything is connected. Everything is right. The Buddha, the state, into dynamic quality and static quality. So you could say like your dynamic quality has improved compared to your static, which is a good thing, right?
I need more definition there to understand that.
Yeah.
So static quality would be just static patterns, right? Things that would repeat themselves very consistently over time. And then one of the most static quality things we could think about is just the world of atoms, for example, right? Atoms combine fairly statically into molecules, right? We figured the formulas out for that. A level more dynamic would be biology, a level more dynamic would be society, a level more dynamic would be intellectual, maybe level more dynamic than that would be spiritual, psychedelic. But yeah, so in terms of what
But and you're not saying you go up a level and ignore the rest. You're saying it becomes a more holistic.
it becomes more, yeah. So the dynamic quality, Robert Pirsig would say, would be more the Buddha nature, and static quality is more certain other realities in which we perceive that dynamic quality.
It kind of makes me think of just like the essential path of life, which is you go from unity, you are your mother and father, into multiplicity. You know, you get birthed, you get into this world, you get, you know, then you play the game of everything's different and I'm separate, and then you have an experience that is transcendence, where you go from multiplicity back to unity, and then we come back down as bodhisattvas because we want to participate in the world with, you know, the world of suffering. We want to participate willingly in the world of suffering because this is the greatest game of all time. You know, like this moment right now, like, yeah, we can stay in infinity forever, and we have, but it is forever. It is infinity. So time doesn't make sense, and it always existed, always will exist, self-existing. And so we come back to participate in the field of time willingly. And that's what I see as this going up and then going back down. And it's just an eternal game. So. And
then you have your own child and are still figuring out how that fits into everything.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, you know, life seeks to continue itself. I think one of the really deep things that Alan Watts always comes back to, honestly, is that if you could dream any dream that you wanted to dream every night, you know.
Yes, I was going to quote this earlier.
Nice.
Yeah, you would first fulfill all your wishes. You would do everything that you wanted to do. And then you'd get to a point where you'd say, you know what, okay, it's a little boring. Let's have a dream that isn't under control. And you would keep going, trying to go deeper, trying to find that edge, to see just how little control you could give yourself, and eventually you would wind up in this room where you are right now, recording this podcast with everyone else.
Isn't that a
just
trip?
relinquishing to random
it's
chaos, like.
Because
I was just saying, you know, it's that we are not in the Western sense, not in the kingly sense, but we're all God pretending he's not or she's not. You know, the lesson of ultimate power is nobody wants to be God because that's not fun.
Exactly. No, I mean, imagine being, you know, I think Jordan Peterson has he exposed me to this line, which is an ancient Jewish concept, which is like, what does a being with omniscience, omnipotence, and omnipresence lack? You guys know?
I can guess, but I probably won't say it the way that you're going to say it, so you can answer.
Finitude, you know, a finite existence, you know, limits. That which has no limits, the thing that it lacks is limits. So if you put, as a little thought experiment, if you imagine that you were God, so you are the only substance in existence, that's monism right there. So you are the one thing, because there's no such thing outside of infinity. It just is. So it is the thing that keeps spreading. And so you are, you know, you have absolute knowledge, nothing, no more surprises, nothing to do, nothing to conquer. You just exist, and you always exist. How long could you stay there? And the answer is forever. And then you're going to have a dream where you say, you know what? I want to have a dream where I'm not in control, where you would rather suffer than be alone, and that is why we're here.
Absolutely. Now I will point out.
makes a
So
lot of sense.
one of the big and most important concepts in Buddhism and Hinduism is also non-duality. The earlier on, it was brought up the sort of Big Bang explanation of the universe. And when I was reading I took a course on Asian philosophy back in college, and one of the things that we had to do for it was to read the Upanishads. And if you ever read the Upanishads, it is, they keep telling the creation of the universe in multiple conflicting ways from chapter to chapter. The point being that it didn't necessarily happen exactly like this, but we're getting at a deeper truth through these stories. One of my favorites.
Yeah, I love that, by the way. Like, I demand that from my religious texts. I hate certainty. Right? The weakest story is because I said so, because I'm an authority.
Yes.
You've lost my attention. I fucking love the I Ching, which has the courage to be like, this is just a random poem. I claim no authority. I don't even know what this means. Good luck working it out yourself. Go. Like,
What was
slow clap.
it? No, they
Anyway,
famously
continue.
asked Bodhidharma, who are you? And he responded, I don't know, planting flowers so the butterflies will
Yeah.
come. So
That's the answer I want from my leaders.
I would love that answer from our leaders. So the essentially to get back into it, my favorite story from this, because I'm a little goth, is in the beginning there was death. And then death said, I am death, let me equip myself with a body. And death proceeded to equip itself with a body, and then proceeded to, because it is death, it needs things to eat. So it starts creating children so that it can devour its own children. Now that's a freaky concept, but if you think about that not in a entropy-like way, but think about that, what do we have? We have the non-dual, the non-differentiated universe that simply is Brahma, the whole. You can't really even say that all is one, because one excludes many. For instance, I am death, let me equip myself with a body. So first, that everything is non-dual, then everything is one, but one implies two, and boom, we get the Big Bang. And what is happening? Death is coming in the form of entropy, trying to absorb and once again link everything as that one Brahma whole. So we have this story, it's ancient story that in a major way links up with our scientific understanding of time and the universe, and I find that to be so incredibly fascinating, that the deeper I look into Buddhism and Hinduism, the more sense it makes, especially when contrasted with Western ideology and the model of the universe that is made popular by Christianity.
Mm-hmm. I want to pick up on one point you said, which is something about, I got this idea of we were talking about infinity, so and duality and stuff. So, what's one symbol of infinity is the Ouroboros, so the snake eating itself. And that makes me think, when you were talking about death had to make children to eat himself, we are the snake that eats itself. That is life. That is the universal tragedy of existence, is that life eats itself. And when I tap into the nirvana place, what I ultimately always come back, because it's uncomfortable to be there, because you are feeling yourself growing and dying at the exact same time. You are feeling light and dark. You're feeling the most beautiful experience of all time, but then the most alone sadness you could ever feel. And it's like swallowing a cube. It's uncomfortable. It doesn't make sense. And so it's so chaotic. I would rather live in this place where things are a little bit more organized, and it's more fun to be surprised. There is no and this is why it's like, Jesus said, love your enemy, because without some sort of struggle, without something to overcome, there would be nothing to do. You couldn't even categorize life as being life if there wasn't something to struggle against. That's why we call it life, So you need death. Life needs death. And that duality piece, like if you're looking at a yin yang, life's on one side, death's on the other. They have to be that way. Without them, it just couldn't be. And so Lao Tzu, has the concept of mutual arising, which is it isn't cause and effect. These things come into existence together. Pairs of opposites always come into existence together.
No,
I fucking love it. And I want to pull us on a psychological track.
All right. Yeah.
Because I think that could tie together a bunch of things. So I think there's a really interesting conversation to be had about the difference between anxiety and depression. And I want to kind of hear your thoughts on this, because I've heard anxiety is described as like fear of the future, and depression described as regret from the past. And both are problems of not living in the present.
Yeah. I don't know what else I'm supposed to add to that. That's awesome.
I think
I'll later on go with
I
it.
think
Go on. Yeah.
you're 100% right on that. I've usually heard depression and anxiety, and I've suffered from both, more depression than anxiety for most of my life. I feel like they say that they're essentially two sides of the same coin. I hadn't thought about it in terms of past and future, so thank you for that, Chris. But what's been very interesting for me is I am somebody who is primarily kinesthetic, so I wind up feeling emotions physically within my body, and anxiety, it winds up manifesting as almost feels like someone's taken a hot coal and set it just on top of my heart. And that will oftentimes become worse when I am not living in the moment, when I am worried about things that are going to happen in the future. And at the same time, depression is very difficult to deal with because it sneaks up on you. And if you live with it so long, you forget that it's there and this is just your reality, which is why, you go to a person, you say you're depressed, they say, I'm not depressed. This is just the way things are, because to them, yes, it is just the way things are. But if you get to a point where the depression leaves you, when I was hiking the Appalachian Trail, Maine to Georgia, I was walking through a field in Virginia, and the sun was coming up over the horizon. I'd been hiking for about 3 weeks, and suddenly, like, the clouds of my depression just blew away, and I was just like, my God, I'm not sad anymore. I didn't even know I was so sad. It feels, anxiety feels like a real thing that is positively, and I don't mean positively as in good, I mean it is adding something to you. It is adding a pain to the experience of life, whereas depression is...
It's more obviously tangible, whereas depression
exactly.
sneaks
The depression is something that it's very insidious. It sneaks in, it saps your energy to the point to where, you don't even fully realize it. I think in a lot of ways the struggle between fear and despair, tinged with like love and joy, I think that is in a way inherent to existence, but those of us who do deal with these mental health issues experience it in a much more visceral way than people regularly do.
And just as there's dualism in the causes, there's also dualism in the manifestation, I've found. For example, my anxiety manifests in a little bit of like OCD, attention deficit. I must do every task right now. I go into hyperactivity, and there's anxiety around not completing tasks. Whereas my depression is the exact opposite. It's apathy. It's not being able to really complete anything. But again, not always being aware that that's what I'm experiencing at the time. And I've also experienced that I don't realize just how apathetic I've become until I have those moments of walking in a field, or now it's, seeing the baby smile, even though I'll be exhausted and hungry and falling into those those shadow instincts, and then hear him cry and start feeling like, oh, I don't want to get up, and then I'll see him smile, and that just vanishes. I'm like, whoa, I didn't even realize how cranky I was, how how disconnected I was.
Yeah, we live in a society that, especially for men, but definitely women as well, it encourages us to disconnect from our emotions, to not feel our feelings. I think that is probably because people that are connected to their emotions oftentimes do not make the best low-level workers, you know. So like, yeah, there's definitely like an element of machismo to the point to where, like, you know, I've gotten to the point where I can be so disconnected from my emotions that, like, my body can be acting in an angry way, but my mind isn't angry, and it doesn't even realize it. So that level of, I guess, disconnection with ourselves, I think that...
There's a really fascinating series of psychological studies which ask people, how good are you at X? Right, like, and it actually phrases it better than that. It says, what percentile are you? Are you in the top 50%? Are you in the top 20%? Judge yourself on the following criteria. And all psychological studies suffer from the fact that they're mostly done at universities, colleges. So they're predominantly wealthy white people. But despite that, you ask these people the studies and they say, I'm above average at almost everything. That is the default score of almost everyone you ask. And they're wrong. Like, when you test them, you realize, no, you are not as good as you think you are. And it is fascinating that, and Jay, to catch you up, talking about the psychological study that says, most people, when asked how good are you at X task, score themselves as above average.
What's the term for that?
Dunning-Kruger effect?
Dunning-Kruger.
It's actually worse than that, because the Dunning-Kruger effect is that idiots think they're good. I'm describing a malaise with the entirety of society where everyone thinks they're better than they are. And the only people that score themselves accurately on tests are the depressed. If you ask a depressed person, how good are you at this? They are the most accurate of any sample. They will tell you, I'm this good, and they are surprisingly accurate. And because of that, there is an argument that says that a lot of depressed people aren't maladaptive, incorrect, psychologically broken, but in fact realistic, accurate, and society itself is just buoyed up by bullshit, and the rest of us are just...
I could get behind that.
Living an ego lie. Like, really.
I think...
Yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry, Jay, you haven't said anything, because why don't you go first?
Yeah, go for it.
Okay, so I want to touch a little bit about... Okay, so we're talking about depression and anxiety. So depression is mostly about people that can't resolve their narrative in the past, so they tend to ruminate. The neuroscientist Neil Seth describes depression as repetitive, ruminative thinking. So, you know, and rumination is going over something that happened over and over in your mind's eye, in kind of like a mental self-flagellation. So,
as we've all done to some extent, right? Like,
exactly.
You're going to sleep, you remember an embarrassing thing you said, you're like, oh my fucking God.
Yeah, and you just replay it over and over like a best hits record that sucks. I know that's kind of a weird thing to say, but
that is absolutely, and thank you so much for sharing that observation with me, because it makes my life make so much more sense.
Yeah, and then when you look at what underpins both depression and anxiety, you find out that they're both underpinned by a hyperactive default mode network. So there's actually studies that prove, like, you know, these people that are anxious or depressed, and even biologically predisposed to be anxious or depressed, they have hyperactive, dense, connected, too densely connected default mode network. So what is that saying? It's saying the neural substrates of the ego is too turned on. It's like a screensaver of horribleness that turns on every 3 seconds, and they can't, so it disengages them with reality, disengages them with the perfection of the present moment. So anxiety is, you know, it's not the past they're worried about, it's the future, it's what might happen. So they're ruminating, except it's not about things that happen, it's about things that might happen. And it's statistically things that couldn't happen. You know, all these worrisome things can't happen. You know, only one thing is going to happen. Go on.
I've had a great theory that the anxious handled the pandemic better than most.
Yeah.
Because they had spent years fixating on what could go wrong, and when shit went wrong, they went, I've imagined worse. This is nothing.
Interesting.
I would agree with that. I mean, if you imagine every possible path, including the bad ones, you're less surprised. I started doing that.
When the bad thing happens,
Yeah.
You're like, oh.
It's like I think I first noticed my anxiety in high school when, like, you know, you would go to a school dance, and when you're a dramatic teenager, it's like every bad thing could go wrong. So I would think of my friend group and like the current drama that was going on and what is the worst possible thing that could happen, and then it would always happen, and to be like, okay, I'm ready for this.
On a trip one time, I was at we went to Coney Island and went through. It had been hit.
And that was the worst thing that could have happened.
Never go to Coney Island. Interestingly enough, I was having a great time until the Seal show, and the reason why was they were playing Cotton Eye Joe, and I was sitting there in the.
Sorry, the black singer seal.
Actual literal seals.
Animals. Okay.
Yeah,
that's worse.
I'm just watching this, and I'm sitting there. There's not a lot of people in the audience. The place kind of got a little ravaged by Hurricane Sandy a few years before. But I'm watching them do this seal show, and they're playing Cotton Eye Joe. And I'm like, they're just putting that on to put something on. There is no reason whatsoever why Cotton Eye Joe goes with seals. And this sent me into like a kind of a tailspin. And my wife and I wound up walking down the boardwalk, and I sat down and I was like, I'm so afraid that, because I've done this, that I've done drugs, I'm going to become this person who is completely overcome with anxiety. And she's like, isn't that you right now? And I'm just like, oh, well, this isn't so bad.
The self-fulfilling... The self-fulfilling prophecy.
My wife essentially confirmed my deepest, darkest fear was actively happening, and
you were surviving
it completely through it because okay, I'm fine, and I wound up having a wonderful time after that. But like again, it's fighting the universe, fighting yourself, tensing up, all of these things. Create suffering, and they can create, I guess, psychological discomfort.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm going to pull us off on a tangent. Before I do, does anyone else have any final thoughts on sort of depression, anxiety versus usual psychology?
One more thing on anxiety. So I picked this up originally from Alan Watts, but it's great. So he talks about how we have two types of attention. Basically, there's like a spotlight of attention, and then there's like the floodlight. So spotlight being... Okay, go on.
Old theory, by the way. Posner, God, 50s, 40s, yeah. And it pulls a few strands together. The idea that the bandwidth, right? We have so much going on in our subconscious brain, but our consciousness only has the capacity to look at things like a spotlight shooting through things. And if you've ever suddenly solved a problem that you weren't aware you were working on, that kind of explains why, right? You have and it's why the idea that, you only use 7% of your brain is fucking bullshit. Try and lobotomize any of your brain and you'll find out that you kind of need all of your brain. Like, you're definitely using your brain, but it's true. When you observe it, it seems that only some parts are firing from certain tests for a reason. And that's because the whole thing is working in the round. And then there is this attentional guard shining a spotlight that goes duh. And if you've ever someone asks you who was Queen in 1688 in England, and I don't know, forget it, and then you continue going about your day, driving your car, having conversations with people, and suddenly come up with the answer, it's because some other part of your brain was still working on that.
Exactly.
Anyway, back to you.
So the unconscious, which would be the floodlight. And so he talks about how anxiety is basically an oscillation produced when you shine the spotlight or the microphone towards like a speaker. So if I had a speaker behind me right now, this microphone would be picking up what the speaker is putting in. So my voice would be going into the speaker, and then would come out louder here, and it would go back in here, and it would create a vicious cycle that makes it go woo in like less than 2 seconds. And so that's anxiety. it's this oscillation because you're worried about being worried about being worried about being worried. And so the idea is take the spotlight off yourself, take the microphone off these thoughts, focus on something else, because depression has also been categorized as a disease of self-focus. These people are focusing on themselves and their past and this narrative that they didn't resolve, and so they can't live in the now because they're stuck in 1986 or whatever. You know what I mean?
What about climate crisis anxiety? I find that a hard one.
I don't know if that's okay. So what I will say is this: there are some legitimate fears and things we should be anxious about, but like anything, any system can get out of whack. And so anxiety and depression is just an out of whack system in the sense that like your default mode network is hyperactive, and it's you're thinking too much instead of perceiving. Instead of just being in the present, you are letting your mind run off like an untrained puppy and think about whatever it wants to. And then you're torturing yourself with your own imagination or your own memory system. And that's the problem, is we have this amazing imagination and this amazing memory, but we don't know how to use it. So that's why meditation is so powerful, because it helps you figure out the gap between this thought and the next, and this awareness, and that I am not my thoughts. I am not my desires. I have my desires. My desires don't have me. I can have anxious thoughts about climate, but I can only do as much as I can do, and I can only influence as much as I can influence. And excessive worry isn't going to help anybody, except it's going to shave years off my life. And is that worth it?
Not just even that. Sorry,
no,
Chris, go.
Yeah, please let me strike the balance here, because it's really important. I think, your microphone feedbacking is the opposite of signal detecting genuine threats, right? We have this system, this limbic system of, oh my God, what are the threats around us, for a very good reason. And when you put the mic too close to the speaker and you get this weird feedback loop, you're stuck in your ego, or you're stuck in your head, or in a negative, self-destructive pattern. That really is a misfiring of a very important system. You're right to raise it as a concern, Ryan, because there are actual credible threats, and the problem is that our system gets misfired all the time, right? Every media we use, right? The news we watch, the phones we stare at, right? Hack that system and go, attention, alarm, look at this, your uncle's racist, all these things, right? And unfortunately, there is real shit happening in the world, and there is real stuff that's eating away at our quality of life, and that we should be focusing on. And it's very hard to judge, because not only are we dealing with this system of narcissism, this culture of egotism, right? But we're dealing with these media companies, advertising companies that are trying to hack it, trying to own it. They want every second of your attention. That is what they're fighting for. There is no longer any land to be colonized, right? The fight right now we're watching is the colonization of our attention spans.
Planting a flag on
this
our
is
eyeballs.
Very, very fucking... Yeah, it's very fucking dangerous to talk about in terms of Buddhism and mental health.
Well,
my gorgeous son.
Nice. Hey.
He always makes a guest appearance these days.
Oh, cool.
Something about little kids' hair is just so gorgeous.
He's nearly got a mullet, I know. But that's a really important distinction to make, is that, for every careful, considered, mathematical, ego, id, whatever, however you strata the brains, right? For every overthinking decision we make versus for every instinctual decision we make, there are huge corporations with trillion-dollar budgets trying to hack it all, just trying to take it all.
It's just attentional fatigue.
Well,
things like climate crisis are worldwide, but also, looking at the United States, we do have a big problem with mass shootings. But it's kind of almost become one of those things where they happen so often that you feel them, but it's emotional fatigue. It's when when you're hearing about a new one every single day. There's a few websites that track them now, and they're literally happening every single day. There are gun deaths every single day in the U.S. And you hear about the big ones on the news, but then it's like those are the stories that get blown out in the news that do deserve attention because it's people dying, but you're hearing about it every single day. And if you devote that trauma and that much energy to each one, you can't function.
How many times have you guys heard Republicans say, if climate change is really as bad as it is, then we can't do anything, we shouldn't change anything because we're all just going to die? Like that's...
Well, this is a new phenomenon, by the way, and for those that have been tracking it, we knew they'd do this. They pivoted from "it's not real" to "it's real, but it's so big there's nothing we can do about it." Like, we knew they would play this card. Like, this was always the way it was going to play.
So to tie this together before we move on, Chris, I have a theory about faith. And this actually came to me on a trip. I was off by myself. I was walking around Harlem, and I got to a point where ego death started to happen. And I was walking up the street, and suddenly I was like, oh, I could do anything. I could just walk into traffic. No, don't think about walking into traffic, and I got to this point where my conscious brain, my spotlight consciousness, I had to say, take a back seat and let my body take me home. And at that point, that's exactly what happened. I dropped out of that, went to the muscle memory. I stopped. I did everything that I needed to, and I was back at my door. And what occurs to me, and this is a theory I've had for years about faith and like what purpose faith serves within the human organism. And it's this. With regard to our egos, we oftentimes, because we are a creature that is so vulnerable, we usually overestimate the forces that are arrayed against us and underestimate ourselves, because by doing that, we are more careful and we are less likely to die. But what we need is a manual override for the times that the ego, that response isn't useful. So people say, faith can move mountains. It literally can, in the sense that we are all capable of a lot more than we think we're capable of. But that's reality.
So I have a really important thing to build on this. So do you know like the theory from the movie Idiocracy that the smartest, nicest people aren't having kids, whereas the worst, stupidest people are having loads? And likewise, are we not in danger of the smartest, wisest people refusing to push their values, their views, their egos on society, when those should be the people that most should be doing it?
And so we have the sharks and the vultures and pushing it onto the most credulous people.
Or it's the fact that we're all on a podcast sharing our opinions proves that theory instantly wrong.
I mean, I feel like Idiocracy, that movie is really, it's not talking about intelligence, it's talking about class. And there's something to understand, like, especially in the United States. A friend of mine, she went into the hospital to have her baby, and she had insurance, and the hospital tried to charge her baby $77,000 for their own birth. Now it was a paperwork error, and that got, sorted out. But if you'll notice, in the United States, the only people who can have kids and also have socialized health care are poor people on Medicaid. So, the average cost with insurance to have a child in the United States is before pre-pandemic, pre-inflation, $6,000.
Right. So part of the narrative of that story is the middle class that falls in the gaps.
Yeah,
right?
Exactly. The thing is that
as always happens with a non-nationalized healthcare system.
Yeah, you're either more affluent, so the cost doesn't matter, or you're less affluent, so the state gives more help.
And when you're
and the middle people.
When you're part of the middle class, particularly like the upper middle class, where you're making, or no, I'd say the middle class, where you're making money, but you're like one of the average American families that cannot afford a single unforeseen $500 expense without taking on more debt. The economic system directly disincentivizes you from breeding. And the Republicans' answer to this
Well,
was
this is
force
why
them to not
the
use
Buddha said.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, this is why the Buddha said, like, American healthcare is bullshit.
Yeah, I think I read that.
We as a population are kept on the edge of a knife because that is where we make the most best obedient workers, at least as far as like.
I mean, the good news is, don't worry, no one looks towards your healthcare system and is about to
Thank
emulate
God.
it. So you're not spreading the problem. Put it that way.
Yeah, but I'm here, Chris. Get me out of here.
Dude, you're welcome. Europe will welcome you with open
It's-
arms.
You're not Europe anymore, Chris.
Oh yeah, well,
Don't
yeah,
you
that's why
forget.
I'm inviting you to his house.
It's funny because I was actually born in Italy and I've been trying to get an Italian passport, and it's very ironic that I am attempting to flee to Italy to escape fascism. Though of course Mussolini's
Times change.
well, I don't know if they changed so
It's
much.
cyclical.
Mussolini's granddaughter is
Although,
now.
Yeah.
in good news, like,
Exactly.
Oh yeah.
You sure you want to go to Italy?
yeah,
Well,
yeah,
Italy's
I
part
can
of the
recommend
EU.
some
I
nice
can
fashion
go to Italy and
countries
then go somewhere else.
for now. There you go.
Okay.
But I mean, Trump seems to be dying a death, right? So we can all
Thank God.
celebrate that
Yeah, and Bolsonaro was defeated
politically
in Brazil.
and physically. There you go.
And
It's all slight victories, but yeah. Let's celebrate
I'll
them
take
at
'em.
least. Yeah,
Don't
exactly.
you dare! Like, I'm taking.
It's
what I
like
can get right now.
50.1% left. Yes, right.
I'll take
yes.
it.
Well, remember, there's got to be the good and the bad, the light and the dark.
the
So pendulum always swings back. You just gotta deal with it in the
game
intro.
of black and white.
Guys, our attempt here was always so broad. We were never going to nail it in one podcast. But I have enjoyed it thoroughly.
Same.
I hope you'll come back for me for a second.
Absolutely, if you'll have me, and I
Yeah.
promise not to come in 45 minutes into the podcast.
That was good. Like we had a relatively drug-free session before you showed up.
Oh, that's beautiful. I
Speak for
mean,
yourself.
Slid in at the right
I'm
moment.
pulling down. I'm walking into a bar and lowering it.
But
Nice.
would anyone like to end on some coherent closing thoughts?
Not me if it's coherent. Somebody else go.
That was my attempt to discourage Brent from talking.
Up to our guests.
You will never succeed.
I have a coherent thought to end on. So hopefully you can pop up what would you say, like a slide or something like that when we show this. But it's the idea that we talked about this earlier, that language is extremely powerful and the words that we use are extremely powerful. And Chris, you've said the word hallucinogens a few times. And so I think we should stop calling them hallucinogens and start calling them psychedelics because it's a little more appropriate. Hallucinogens denotes that it's like these are just hallucinations that have no bearing in reality, when in fact we've all benefited massively from taking these plant medicines or entheogens, which means
Entheogens.
to
I like that's the word I
Yes.
like. Even better
to
than
reveal the
psychedelic.
God
Yeah.
within. And
Yeah.
psychedelics, what, psyche, mind, soul, and delos, to reveal, to mind revealing, like these are the words to use. And when it comes to depression and anxiety, like stop labeling these things as conditions when really they're just misalignments with what your highest self and your entire psyche wants. And so the slide I want to show is like a spectrum of alignment that, on one end you have depression, and on the other end you have the opposite of that. And you know what the opposite of that is? The opposite of depression is a flow state, and a flow state is a miniature transcendent experience. So what we're seeing is, life exists on a spectrum, and you can't exist in a flow state always because it's just biologically unsustainable. But the idea is to try and tap into more of those states where you're not so much in your head and you're more perceiving and you're just more aligned with what your entire psyche and body wants, and you listen to your ultimate guidance system here. And that's what's going to lead people ultimately to the most happiness and fulfillment is being okay with their narrative and their story, and being okay with all parts of themselves and what all parts of themselves want. That's what I would say.
Beautiful.
It's wonderful.
Nice.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I can't end it better than that. You've been absolutely wonderful host. Thank you so much. I hope you've enjoyed it.
Oh my god, so much. This is a great one.
Right? Let's do
Yeah.
it again.
I'm down.
Absolutely.
I've never done it with so many people, but that was fun, man. It's like popcorn.
This will be great.
So-
We can talk about Pixar's Soul next time.
Yes.
Okay.
I mean, we could all talk about kids' movies and bring that
Yeah,
into it. So, guys, thank you so much. I know, like, early, young baby to look after. The time you've given us is so precious. I appreciate it so much.
He's
I hope
been
you've
so
enjoyed it
good.
as much as I have.
I've got him on a little monitor right here.
Yeah.
Serendipitously, it's
I've been
once
looking
again
forward to
come
this.
together. It's worked. No, likewise, like just a meeting of minds. Reddit
Yeah.
has delivered again. Thank you so much.
They have. Awesome.
It's an absolute pleasure.
Oh, you guys.
If you have a podcast, we'll come on it. And thank you so much, sincerely, for a thought-provoking
Yeah.
and entertaining conversation.
It's a pleasure to meet all of you guys. So thank you.
Much love to you all.
Much love.
Likewise.
Absolutely.
Good evening.
Nam-myoho Renge Kyo.
Stop all the recording.
Yeah. Oh yeah.